I am honored to be here. Join me to thank the Creator for this day and for allowing us to be able to assemble in this fashion for the 2022 executive session. To open, I shall, in a short form of this Thanksgiving address in Mohawk. It's said before all else. Subaya disu, zatahon siyos, tuwat kwanunghalado, agweku. Sinaho daw sun takwawi na ko, tumujagan ay akatsanuni. Takwawi na kakfao, na ko nunaya gyusik. Takwawi na ho daw sun, ang kanunam dawi, kanya dalake. Ula yulakot salayo, nene sa kwachia. Asutaka kalakwa ya kisat katagunong tugya, jinijido di daw hagara diksaw kung anong pasong. Tudiyo shukili hunyani, tanong gaili niyo kweda garo di kwatu, ne tanong ne skanyadaliyo. I would like to thank, on your behalf, NCAI staff and the executive people who are always at the forefront to help us in Washington. In Washington, they hear the bills that are going in at midnight that's going to affect us. And they inform us, they get the word out and we have a chance to get there. Also, we would like to thank all the staffs at the frontline workers who are doing their best to keep our communities safe. Mental health workers for helping our people to keep their minds strong. Tribal staff for providing services to our people every day, and for the people to give us their best cooperation to help get us a better tomorrow.
Please welcome Dante Desiderio, Chief Executive Officer, National Congress of American Indians.
Meku. Welcome to the 20th Annual State of Indian Nations Address. Dante Desiderio, a citizen of the Saponi and the Chief Executive Officer of the National Congress of American Indians. I'd like to thank Alma Ransom, former Chief of the St. Regis Mohawk, and former NCAI Treasurer for starting us off in a good way with our Thanksgiving blessing. We appreciate your words and longstanding service to Indian country. NCAI is the oldest, largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaskan Native organization in the country. Since 1944, NCAI has worked on behalf of its members to serve and protect the interests of tribal nations. One of our core functions is to provide tribal leaders the opportunity to engage with the federal government in a nation-to-nation discourse that will tip the scale towards greater prosperity, health, and overall well-being for all of our citizens. We take pride in our role in serving the broad interests of Indian country, and on behalf of NCAI, we extend our gratitude to everyone watching and participating in this virtual space. Before we get started with the presentation, we want to take a moment and share how everyone watching can participate in today's event. For those of you following along on social media, please use the hashtag SOIN 2022. That's hashtag SOIN 2022. We also have a conference app, which you can access at ncai.events to follow along with the State of Indian Nations and the Executive Council Winter Session, which follows after this morning's address. Use the app to register, view our sessions, and learn more about our speakers. Getting back to today's program, we welcome and acknowledge the tribal leaders in attendance who champion advocacy work for the betterment of their tribal nations. I also want to welcome our tribal organization leaders and partners with whom we work side by side to advocate for tribal nations. If we were in person, I would be acknowledging Ernie Stevens, Chairman of NIGA, who never misses these events. Chairman, we'll look forward to seeing you in person when we're in person again. And a special welcome to the students attending today and the youth participating in our Native Youth Leadership Summit. As our future leaders, we encourage you to ask questions, learn as much as you can, and participate. Thank you to all our members and individuals, our federal partners, and thank you to the NCAI Executive Committee representatives who are joining us from their various regions, and to all who serve with NCI as we carry forward the mission of supporting, protecting, and advancing tribal sovereignty for all of Indian country. So I'd like to now welcome our hardworking and outstanding Youth Commission leaders who are here to share remarks, to introduce today's keynote speakers, and to participate in our Q&A event. Please welcome Jessica Lambert, a citizen of the Choctaw Nation and a registered first-generation descendant of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. She's a senior at Princeton University studying anthropology, and she'll be joined with Simon Friday, a citizen of the Tlingit and Haida Nation, and a senior at the University of Fairbanks who is studying psychology. These students serve as co-presidents of the NCAI Youth Commission, and we are proud to feature their remarks for the first time ever during a State of Indian Nations address. Please welcome Jessica and Simon.
Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Jessica Lambert. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation, and I serve as co-president of the NCAI Youth Commission.
My name is Simon Friday, and I am a citizen of the Organized Village of Cake, and I serve as co-president on the NCAI Youth Commission.
The NCAI Youth Commission is a space for tribal youth to come together and discuss solutions to the unique challenges we face within our communities. The Youth Commission is a space for Native youth to stand together as a working body of NCAI to highlight the priorities, meet with Native leaders, and inform key advocacy decisions.
This is the first time in NCAI's history that a Youth of Indian Nations address is being given. More and more, the Native youth of this country are leading the charge in advocacy and policy arenas. We lead this charge not just for the present, but for the future of youth everywhere and the 7 generations to come.
Today, we will highlight just a few of the many concerns of the youth of Indian country: education, climate, and mental health. Concerns of education in Indian country are two-pronged. First, representations of Native people in K-12 education are often harmful, destructive, and stereotypical. And second, educational disparities for Native youth limit our potential. Rather than challenging the problematic and oppressive stereotypes about Natives, American schools reinforce them. Almost 90% of public schools do not cover Native American history after 1900, and only a handful of states provide even minimal coverage of the fight against termination and assimilation, much less important eras of advancements, such as the self-determination period or the nation-to-nation period, which we are currently in.
According to a study on Native representation in education, when we Natives do appear in textbooks, it is often as, quote, victims, thieves, drunks, bloodthirsty savages, lazy, and unmotivated, with little to no mention of our successes, heroes, or societal contributions. In many cases, these harmful stereotypes are the only understanding that Americans have of American Indians. This is the education that future US lawmakers are receiving about American Indians. When others do not understand the sovereignty of tribal nations, our co-equal status in the American family of governments, nor who we are today as modern peoples, it becomes ever more difficult to pass and enact meaningful legislation to positively impact tribal communities. to end non-Indian ignorance about America's first people and build a better America. Students in K through 12 schools must receive a rich and complex education about Native Americans that captures the diversity of our 574 federally recognized tribal nations and the dozens more state-recognized tribal nations.
Students must also learn about the history and legal frameworks that undergird our tribe's unique political status. We need a mandated overhaul of teaching about American Indians. K-12 courses about American Indians need to be developed and curricula rewritten, and this work must be led by Native people. To facilitate this massive undertaking, federally funded national resource centers in American Indian Studies should be established, modeled on the currently existing Department of Education Title VI National Resource Centers for International Area Studies. In addition, to address educational disparities, funds need to be directed to K-12 schools in our tribal nation homelands and in other areas with high concentrations of American Indian students.
Another pressing concern for the youth of Indian country is climate change. Environmental assaults plague our lands and are an imminent threat to our generation's survival. Winnebago environmentalist Terry Hansen points out that although our reservations compose only 2% of US lands, 25% of EPA Superfund sites, the most contaminated sites in the US, are in Indian country. Natives are 48% more likely to live in areas that will be inundated due to sea level rise. Our lands are consistently deemed as a dumping grounds for environmental toxins, and our waters are threatened by fossil fuel pipeline development. Currently, the ongoing fight against the construction of pipelines that violate tribal treaty rights. US climate actions thus far have been slow, insufficient, and piecemeal. Instead, the fight against climate change requires radical action and solutions by the US government. In addition, climate research and solutions implementation requires close collaboration with tribal nations.
Finally, a third core concern of the Native youth is mental health and preventative mental health care. We are facing a suicide epidemic among Native youth. Native youth aged 15 to 24 have a suicide rate that is 172% greater than the overall US in the same age range. It is crucial to create spaces and provide resources for tribal youth that are struggling with mental health and generational well-being, as well as helping tribal youth, in addition to all natives, understand how to enact true preventative healthcare through lifestyle choices. The first step to doing this is taking away the stigma associated with battling mental health issues and re-emphasizing our strong cultures, as it is our practices and ways of living that often allow us to live healthy lives. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to the priorities of the youth of Indian country, which include education, climate change, and mental health.
Please do not hesitate to reach out to the NCAI Youth Commission with any questions, and we look forward to working alongside tribal leaders and Native organizations to tackle these issues. And now it is our distinct honor to introduce to you the 23rd President of the National Congress of American Indians,
Fawn Sharp, to deliver the 2022 State of Indian Nations Address. Please welcome Fawn Sharp.
Yohach, Anjak Hiwishka. My name is Fawn Sharp. It is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome those of you watching to the 20th Annual State of Indian Nations Address. I am humbled to stand before you once again as President of the National Congress of American Indians. Today, I am here to give a voice to all of those NCAI represents, to share the story of Indian country's tenacious strength, our vibrant cultures, and to advance the government-to-government relationship between tribal nations and the United States as equal and abiding partners. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the tribal leaders with us today, as well as the elders, advocates, youth, and ever-expanding network of partners and allies who would normally be seated right here in front of me. I also want to applaud the NCAI board who are in attendance. It is because of your dedication and commitment to serving Indian country that we were able to carry out NCAI's first ever virtual elections during the 78th annual convention last fall. Thank you for your confidence, and we are honored to carry on the important work of this difference-making organization on your behalf, just as the founders of the NCAI have intended. Since the first time I stood here to deliver this address, much has changed in the world around us, yet one reality remains. The in 74 tribal nations, dozens of state-recognized tribal nations, and millions of Native peoples across the United States are as strong and resilient as ever. Make no mistake, there is plenty of work to be done, but while we have remained strong through the headwinds and resistance, I want to take pause and for a brief moment to acknowledge and reflect upon where we are and the times we are in, and what we are going through during this global pandemic that has taken many lives and impacted us all tremendously. The strain on our communities, our people, and our leadership has kept us physically apart when our power as nations comes from gathering together, and precisely at the time we need that connection the most. I ask that in this moment you join me in taking a breath and moment of silence in an acknowledgement of those we've lost, the challenges that lie ahead, the cultures, communities, lands, and the waters we fight to preserve, and for the gifts Creator has bestowed upon us to meet these challenges with good hearts and good minds. Thank you. We are here to protect the health and well-being of our communities. As such, this address is not only intended to provide insight into the state of Indian nations, but to raise the bar for advocacy for Native peoples, to ensure our federal trustee gets behind the vision we have for our tribal nations and communities, and to keep rebuilding our economies, to remove the barriers between where we stand now and the bright vision of tribal nations exercising our full spectrum of sovereignty, a task that cannot be accomplished by any individual or one organization alone. It takes all of us, it takes Indian country to come together and create solutions, to build bridges and forge a courageous path forward. I must acknowledge the transformative leaders who came before us, guiding us with their knowledge and experience, and laying the firm foundation for which we will carry this work for generations to come. To my fellow tribal leaders that I now stand shoulder to shoulder with, now more than ever, NCAI needs your guidance, your partnership, and your help in order to shape our futures and meet the collective needs of our people. When we move together as one, we are able to heighten the presence of tribal nations and claim our role as a vital part of the original American family of governments. The inclusion of tribal nations in political and public discourse over the past year has never been higher. And it's the decades of collective advocacy, education, and outreach that have set the stage for the moment that we are now in. Our voices have been heard loud and clear, and our strength and wisdom have been put on display. Federal partners have heard our demands for partnership and support and have responded with historic investments and expanded engagement with Indian country. In one of his first presidential memorandums since taking office, President Biden called for strengthening nation-to-nation relationships through enhanced tribal consultation. Doors that were once closed are starting to open. Doors that we open have become more welcoming in ways that neither we nor our ancestors have ever witnessed. This is an important start, but it's up to us, fellow tribal leaders, to show up and walk through those doors so we can continue to push for meaningful consultation, for a stronger government-to-government relationship, and ultimately for free, prior, and informed consent. Our sovereign status demands that the United States government seeks consensus and gets our consent before taking actions that affect our people, our lands, and our sacred sites. And we will not rest until that is what we have. However, in the years since the president's memorandum on tribal consultation, we have seen a concerted effort toward building stronger communication, better understanding of Indian country's priorities, and enhancing partnerships. We are starting to see tangible progress. In fact, we find ourselves in a time where strong Native leaders are being appointed to positions throughout the Biden administration. 6 Native Americans have been nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, the most ever by any administration, and we hope more are to come. We have witnessed the historic confirmation of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Department of Interior. The same department our forebears once fought to educate on tribal issues now has a fierce Native woman, the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary at the helm. And that's just the beginning. We are also seeing the effect of an expanded commitment to Indian country through policies and funding opportunities. Just this past year alone, more than $45 billion were marked for Indian country directly in congressional spending and economic relief legislation. Indian Health Service received more than $6 billion to provide life-saving services, medical treatment, and vaccines to our communities. When our nations are provided the funding, the parity, the deference, we hold up and support our communities and citizens. With the funding and support from the economic relief packages, tribal governments are now getting access to funding and programs that have been historically closed to our nations. In November, Congress passed a once-in-a-generation infrastructure bill and with more than $13 billion designated for Indian country. This hard-won investment sprung from decades of tribal leader advocacy, and $13 billion is only the beginning. Tribal governments are now eligible for funding and programs throughout the new law. We now call on the federal government to uphold a relationship based on respect and full of promise to ensure these programs are implemented effectively. America is only as strong as the foundation of its tribal communities. As the true work and implementation continues, it isn't enough to have a foot in the door. Tribal nations must have a seat at the table where key decisions are being made. Effective and responsible development cannot happen without the input and direction of those on the ground in our communities. Consultation is simply not negotiable. I call on the Biden administration to ensure that tribal nations are consulted with free, prior, and informed consent, to ensure the infrastructure planning that's occurring across this country has tribal nations' feedback embedded within each blueprint. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic exposed a longstanding issue, and that is our nation's digital divide. For Indian country, this pandemic shed an imminent light on the lack of broadband access in our communities. It is not merely a matter of inconvenience, it is the difference between saving a life, accessing education, and delivering essential services. Tribal nations need funding, technical assistance, and workforce development support to ensure that once we close the digital divide, it stays closed for good. Our federal partners must also work together collaboratively and across agencies with tribal nations to make this happen. The federal trust and treaty responsibility to tribal nations also extends beyond infrastructure development. It includes the co-management of our sacred places and ancestral homelands. We commend the Biden administration's first steps to protecting sacred sites that are vital to traditional ways of life, such as the expansion of full protection to the Bears Ears, Grand Staircase Escalante, and the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monuments. The protection of sacred places is vital to maintaining and preserving the distinct identities, traditions, and histories of Native peoples. Co-management practices must be an inclusive and shared responsibility. It is our sovereign right to manage and protect our resources, and it is the federal government's responsibility to ensure that is carried out through cooperative agreements concerning both state and federal lands. With 80% of the Earth's biodiversity being protected by Indigenous peoples, we have demonstrated the value of promoting harmony with the world around us for generations. We have a sacred obligation as the land's original stewards to protect the natural resources that sustain our communities, economies, and ways of life by exercising our traditional ecological knowledge. For example, the Karuk tribe in California, in collaboration with federal and state agencies, has been carrying out their traditional wildfire management systems to combat the devastating effects of wildfire damage from climate change to protect their lands, resources, foods, and ceremonial practices. But the work doesn't just stop with our homelands. We stand with our Indigenous brothers and sisters from across the globe in protecting, preserving, and sustaining Mother Earth. This year has set a precedent for the value of tribal inclusion at all international climate-related conferences and negotiations moving forward. It is impossible to confront the existential crisis of climate change without the world's indigenous leaders. And that has been exemplified through NCAI's participation at the Conference of Parties 26. I was honored and humbled to be the first ever tribal leader to join the US delegation, an important step in ensuring our nation's voices are heard alongside with other world leaders. The world knows and understands disproportionate impacts of climate change to indigenous peoples. As we continue to tackle climate change, there is a new opportunity on the horizon for tribal nations in the post-pandemic economic recovery world to be part of this global conversation. Our tribal nations' sovereign standing demands that we are part of the discussion with the United States when it is working with friends and allies in the public and private sectors. We must seize this moment domestically and internationally. In places where our lands are protected, we must also make sure that they are respected. The Department of Interior has started the process to review 650 offensive Native-themed geographic names on federal lands. The time to reclaim and rename racist and derogatory names which discount our rich histories and thriving, vibrant cultures is now. We've seen the tides of change across the country as we continue to call on the federal government, state and local governments, school boards, and sponsors to help us finally retire offensive and dehumanizing Native-themed mascots. And in the past year, much progress has been made. Nationally, nearly 70 school mascots have been retired. 3 states, Colorado, Nevada, and Washington, enacted comprehensive legislative bans of Indian mascots at K-12 schools. And finally, with the Washington Commanders and Cleveland Guardians, we begin a new era of accountability and change. We will not rest until the last offensive Indian mascot is retired, such that the schools our children attend may foster equitable learning environments and well-being for all students. History has shown us the importance of the environments in which our Native children learn and grow. And Indian country has waited generations for the truth and justice owed to our ancestors and elders taken away from our communities and placed in boarding schools. While all of our communities were changed forever under the federal boarding school policies, many of our ancestors never made it home. Secretary Holland establishing Interior's Indian Boarding School Initiative begins the shining of a light as we finally have a place for our stories and traumas to be heard. We know this is not where we'll find healing, but it is a place where we may find some justice. We will also continue to push for a Congressional Truth and Healing Commission to ensure these atrocities are investigated fully. We know the truth of what happened, and it is time the world does too. When the world hears our voices, change happens. Nowhere is that more clear than at the ballot box. Despite the challenges presented by the pandemic and with significant pre-existing barriers to exercising our right to vote, more Native people still cast votes in the 2020 election than ever before. We made an enormous impact that resulted in an increase of Native representation in the US House of Representatives and in state legislatures nationwide. We vote because we know how important our voices are and what happens when they are ignored. This is why tribal nations have been calling on Congress to pass reforms that protect Native people's right to vote, and why we work tirelessly to inform our people of how they can exercise their right to vote. And so I urge each of you here, as tribal leaders, as concerned citizens, as members of this democracy, make your voices heard, get out and vote. Native representation is not only important in elected office, but in judicial systems. Tribal nations and tribal communities are impacted by federal laws and courts more so than anyone else. When we do not have Native voices, perspectives, or experience on the federal bench, Often decisions are made that ignore our history, sovereignty, and our truths. These decisions have long-lasting effects. In the past year, we've seen the confirmation of Judge Lauren King, the first Native American federal judge to serve in Washington state, and the nomination of the first ever Native American federal judge in California, Sunshine Suzanne Sykes. With constant attacks on our sovereignty, our jurisdiction, and the ability to protect our Native children in courts, we must ensure that we keep fighting for our sovereignty, our laws, and our future. We must also further protect our communities and citizens by continuing to advocate for the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act. Acknowledging and restoring tribal nations' jurisdiction over criminals that target our Native women and children is essential to making sure justice gets served for Indian country. Together, we can dramatically change the environment in Indian country by strengthening VAWA to empower tribal sovereignty and safety. We have seen many promises fulfilled over the last year. We have seen strides where once they were baby steps. We have seen doors open that were once locked, but we must not forget all the promises that came before that were not kept, and that some of the most important promises remain broken. We must always refer back to our histories, treaties, and agreements. The 2018 Broken Promises Report, which illuminates the vast needs in Indian country in everything from joblessness to poverty to healthcare to public safety to education. While the historic investments into Indian country over the past year are progress to solve the centuries of mistrust, we must keep fighting forward to hold the federal government to its trust responsibility to every tribal nation. It is not enough to let Congress off the hook for failing to fulfill their trust responsibility to another generation. To the extent that there is a gap between our economic conditions today and the bright future that we collectively see for all tribal nations, our trustee has that responsibility to get behind our vision and support tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Tribal nations have become leading employers in our country. The means we must keep fighting for full appropriations and especially for advanced appropriations. This means that our trustee must get behind our vision for a healthy tribal economy, including supporting tribal tax policies. This means removing the regulatory barriers for taking our land back into trust to protect it for generations to come. This means that the federal government, the parity with state and local governments, must continue to be the norm going forward. This means raising the bar of accountability and the trust responsibility. If this year has shown us anything for certain, it is never too late to mend broken promises. No matter the challenges, Native people have risen to the occasion. Our ancestors have gifted us with their wisdom, with their strength, and with their tenacity. Their will to protect our communities is embedded within our DNA. We all have a role to play. It is our duty as Native people to honor these gifts by using every mechanism available to us to practice our cultures, protect that which is sacred to us, and make the will of our people heard. It is our duty as tribal leaders to champion advocacy efforts to ensure the needs of our people are met and to help shape and to secure the future of the generations yet to come. And it is the duty of the National Congress of American Indians to ensure that we aren't just a DC-centric organization, but that we are and always will remain a representative Congress of tribal nations. Our strength lies just as much in our diversity as it does in our unity, and we invite more tribal nations to stand beside us. Much of the success discussed today is a direct result of NCAI recommitting to supporting the vision of tribal nations and creating the spaces and opportunities to bring tribal leaders together, to amplify our voices, and to march the collective will of hundreds of tribal nations through Capitol Hill and to the doorstep of the White House. NCAI exists to fight for the inherent rights of tribal citizens and to protect the sovereignty of every tribal nation. We are here to work with every one of our partners to hold on to what we've gained this year and to keep fighting for what is right for our tribal nations. And we're only going to become stronger. In order to do so, self-determination, sovereignty, and resilience must keep guiding our way. We stay grounded in our collaboration with non-tribal entities, from the administration to federal lawmakers and to state governors. It is your duty to respect our right to self-governance, to work with us for the betterment of the people we serve, and to fully honor the trust and treaty obligations this country holds with tribal nations. Despite the hardships we've endured in 2021, there have been many positive steps forward. However, we acknowledge there is still much work to be done to build upon the successes of this past year. It will take all of us working together to create solutions and build a brighter future for our communities. I ask that you join us in raising the bar of advocacy and reinforcing our commitment to creating positive change in Indian country. In answering this call to action, there is no doubt Indian country will continue to advance the bold legacy of leadership that we inherited to ensure generations yet to be born will live in a cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous and just future. I have never been more excited about the progress we've made and the incredible opportunities in front of us. The time has come. The moment is now. Let's get to work. Siakwea.
President Sharp, let's get to work. Thank you for that powerful State of Indian Nations address. And again, thank you to our outstanding Youth Commission for your timely and relevant remarks. So now we'd like to turn and introduce today's congressional responder, Congresswoman Sharice Davids. Representative Davids, a citizen of Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, was sworn into the 116th Congress in 2019 as one of the first Native American women to serve in Congress. We are pleased to have her provide the congressional response to the State of Indian Nations address. Congresswoman Davids, we're proud to welcome you today to give the congressional response.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, I don't know, depending on where everybody's at. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Dante, for your introduction and the work that you're doing. Also, I want to say I wasn't able to log on in time to hear. I'm pretty sure a Thanksgiving was provided earlier, and just wanted to say I appreciate that is something that we often will open with, because while as President Sharp said, there is a lot to be done going forward, there is also a lot for us to take the time out to show gratitude and to honor. So I also, before I really get into the remarks that I have prepared, I just want to acknowledge the NCAI Youth Commission officers for your words and your and just the way that you're out there, really just creating the future for Indian country and for our country as a whole. I think that we have an amazing future ahead of us, in large part because of the things that you all are doing. And I want to also just highlight and thank you for bringing up the mental health crisis that we know is so important and needs to be addressed. It's a huge priority for me personally and for my office. And yeah, so I really, really appreciate the Youth Commission always, but today in particular. Thank you, President Sharp, to NCAI and all our relatives who are tuning in and creating this space to amplify the voices of Indian country. I'm coming to you live from my office in Kansas City, Kansas. But I want to make sure that you know your message is definitely being heard in Washington, D.C. amongst my colleagues on Capitol Hill and certainly across the administration. I'm definitely humbled and honored to be here today to deliver the 2022 congressional response to the state of Indian nations. I'm Representative Sharice Davids. I am a proud citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. I'm the daughter of an Army veteran, and I have the honor of representing the 3rd Congressional District in Kansas. And I'm looking forward to when we get to do this sort of thing in person again, because I think we all want to get back to that. And as President Sharp said, the road to recovery is definitely long. My hope is that we're all starting to see the sun break through the clouds a little bit on this pandemic. Vaccinations are going up. Our economy is moving in the right direction. And, I think it's well known amongst this group that the pandemic has certainly disproportionately impacted American Indians, Alaskan Natives, our indigenous communities. With the infection rate at times being 3.5 times higher than non-Hispanic whites in our country, and seeing a higher mortality rate at times too. I think the pandemic has certainly been felt in every corner of Indian country, and I just want to send my prayers and my heart is with everybody who's been affected, particularly folks who have lost loved ones. I know that that's something that a lot of folks have been dealing with. But I think I kind of started talking about this earlier. I do have hope. I have hope for our tribal nations and communities, seeing that tribes really followed the science and came together to protect our elders and youth and communities. When hard-fought resources reached tribal nations, we saw the implementation of vaccine programs that really were the best fit for each of your specific communities. And I think, seeing the IHS, tribal health programs, urban Indian organizations really led the way in vaccination rates, with the 2.1 million doses being administered in pretty quick order once those things were made available. I think it really showed the strength of Indian country coming together to protect our communities. And I also really want to say thank you to our frontline workers that have made really huge sacrifices to care for our communities, particularly in this last couple of years. Just hope that you all know that your efforts have not gone unnoticed or unappreciated. I think being that this is the congressional response, I do want to make sure that folks know that I'm committed to doing everything that I can to continue to support the recovery that we're looking at across tribal nations, whether we're talking about health or economic prosperity. And for folks, I just jumped right in. For folks who maybe don't know, when I was elected in 2018, I was one of the first 2 Native American women ever to serve in Congress, alongside my dear friend and now Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. And that was, she left me, which is fine. I'm glad she's doing the job that she's doing. But it was definitely an incredible honor. And I will say that since then, we have seen some really amazing progress with Secretary Haaland at the helm of Interior. The bar has been raised now for generations to come without how the federal government should be working with tribes, and strides are being made to make sure that that work is done in a much better way. Secretary Haaland and this administration's efforts to be accountable to tribal nations is shown not just in rhetoric but also in actions. In this last year, we saw, and President Sharp spoke to some of this. We've seen Interior and the administration create the derogatory geographic names task force, the missing and murdered unit, the federal boarding school initiative. And that's just a few of the things that we've seen. I know that Secretary Holland will be speaking later, and just publicly want to say how much I appreciate her leadership and compassion, and of course her friendship. I'm also really proud of the direction that Secretary Holland is taking the federal taking and helping the federal government. And I know that tribal nations and leadership have an opportunity now through those conversations to really have great strides in strengthening the indispensable federal trust responsibility. I don't want to repeat too much of what President Sharp said, but we have seen some really historic leaps forward for the representation of Indian country in the federal government over this last year. With Secretary Holland being the first Native person appointed to the cabinet, and then we also have 5 Indigenous Native members of Congress, 2 women and 3 men. And as co-chairs of the bipartisan Congressional Native American Caucus, Representative Tom Cole and I have worked with our vice chairs, the leadership of the House committees, and our other colleagues to ensure that the needs of tribal nations and communities are prioritized, and that our voices are included in discussions from healthcare to infrastructure. A priority of the Congressional Native American Caucus is to educate our colleagues on the complexities of Indian country. And that includes doing things like hosting educational briefings on matters of access to healthcare, broadband, infrastructure. Those are some of the briefings that we've had, and we're going to continue to host and plan briefings in the future. And it's not in my notes, but I do want to say a quick shout out and thank you to Rainey Williams, who works in my office. She started during this congressional session, jumped right in, and has been a huge support and taken a lot of initiative around the Congressional Native American Caucus. And so just want to publicly thank Rainey for all the work that she's doing. And then I also want to thank NCAI for joining the caucus to take that time to educate members and staff about the unique relationship that tribal nations have with the federal government. Because every single member of Congress has that obligation to uphold, to be aware of and educated on the federal trust responsibility. The Congressional Native American Caucus has always been a bipartisan caucus, and that's because Indian country issues are not partisan issues. And I think that making sure that the Native American Caucus is addressing issues in a bipartisan way, as we look forward to continuing our work, is going to be key to having that lasting federal policy that will not just acknowledge but adhere to the federal trust responsibility and truly recognize tribal sovereignty. And that work that I'm doing, not just with the Native Caucus, but with all of my colleagues, extends, of course, to my positions on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, to the Small Business Committee. And through those roles, I'm working not only to support the recovery of Indian country, but really to build a strong foundation for the future. Infrastructure is a vital tool for increasing access to opportunity. And I certainly believe that with the right policy, we can set a foundation for a serious economic growth over the next decade. And I think that it was a huge accomplishment for Congress to be able to get passed and signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is also sometimes just referred to as the bipartisan infrastructure law. My colleagues and I worked diligently to ensure that this bill had $11 billion for Indian country to create infrastructure investments in our climate, roads, and to help bridge the digital divide. So it's not just because I'm an infrastructure nerd, although I am. I definitely think that the infrastructure bill is going to be something that has a positive impact on Indian country. And, part of the reason that things like that happen is not just me, others, but I know I absolutely made sure to communicate at every single meeting we had during negotiations, whether I was with my colleagues at the White House or on the committee in hearings, that Indian country has to be included, has to be at the table, and those resources need to be there. Okay, I'll stop with the infrastructure. I could go on for days about infrastructure, but the last thing I'll say, I promise, is that the Native American Caucus has already hosted some briefings with both Interior, the Commerce Department, and others to try to make sure that not just that we know, but also everybody knows how they're holding tribal consultations while they're implementing the infrastructure law, and the programs and policies that were included in the what really is historic infrastructure investment is going to build our economy back better than it was before and help create good paying jobs, and invest in infrastructure in a smart and sustainable way. We heard from President Sharp about the number of acres, the amount of land and resources that our Native communities are the stewards of. And so I think that that's really important. I can see you guys are on the screen now, and I'm gonna try to let me just see. I have a couple bullet points. I'm trying to I'll mention a couple of bills, in part because President Sharp, you touched on a few of these things. I have been supportive of and co-sponsored the Urban Indian Health Confer Act. It's passed out of the House. It's awaiting consideration in the Senate. This bill would help ensure that rural and urban communities have their health needs met. And I think, we've seen why having our health systems being well-resourced and stable is so important. And so advanced appropriations for IHS would allow greater planning for that. And this bill would help with that. And it would also help with recruitment and retention of healthcare providers so that we have higher quality care for our tribal communities, both on reservations and in urban areas. And, I guess just so everybody knows, Congressman Don Young, Congresswoman Betty McCollum, and Congressman Tom Cole have been tireless advocates for advanced appropriations for IHS. And I know a lot of folks who are on here have as well. So hopefully we are, leaps and bounds ahead of where we were before. But I would encourage folks to reach out to your senators and encourage support for the advanced appropriations for IHS. And then I do want to talk about the Truth and Healing Commission that would be part of the efforts to address boarding school policies. So there's the bill that I've introduced, Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act, which would help because it establishes a formal commission to investigate and document assimilation practices that occurred and that we heard President Sharp speak to earlier. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who has not been impacted by this in Indian country today because of how big of a issue this has been. And then I think the last thing is the Native American Voting Rights Act. I have reintroduced the Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021. And my friend and colleague, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, who was a leader while he was in the House and continues to be so as a senator, we're all working on this. Also, just really quickly want to say that we're all hoping for the quick, swift recovery for Ben Ray Lujan, and then I feel like the Native American Voting Rights Act is probably the last thing I'll touch on, because it's clearly tribal members and tribal governments have seen that there are unique barriers that exist, and the Native American Voting Rights Act, or NAVRA, would help. Because it requires states to partner with tribal governments on identifying accessible locations for voting registration, polling locations, drop boxes, those sorts of things. Also creates a standard for accepting tribal IDs for voter registration. And then that there's a tribal administrative review process that would need to be adhered to if states are attempting to consolidate or relocate or eliminate polling locations. All right, I'm going to stop, because I know that there's questions and this sort of thing. So I want to give at least a few minutes for that. But I just appreciate all of you so much for your leadership, for your tireless work. And I say you all, not just meaning the folks who are speaking today, but everybody who's listening in, because I know when it comes to the boots on the ground work, you all are doing it.
Well, Congresswoman Davids, it's really great to hear your remarks, and just so amazing to have a Native representing our interest in Congress. So thank you for that, and all the support for Indian country. So we're going to go to the Q&A segment. So we're going to ask you to stay on, and also President Sharp will be coming back, and Jessica Lambert, and the co-vice president, Jonathan Arakawa, will join us for the question and answer segment. Jonathan is a member of the Lower Elwha Klallam tribe and a student at the Evergreen State College and Peninsula College, and is studying for his Bachelor of Arts in Tribal Governance. So we did receive questions during the registration process, and we're going to be jumping in the order here and asking our Native youth a first question, and then we'll open it up. And I know Chairwoman Cheryl Andrews Malteus, Wampanoag, Wampanoag, has her hand up. We'll go to her after this first round of questions. So to Jessica and Jonathan, you talked about the mental health issues for youth. So we've seen this complete disruption of all the social networks, how people are attending schools. All of these things have had a really disruptive toll on the mental health of our youth, and especially the teenage youth. Tell us, if you were to talk to a tribal leader, what do we need to know? How do we need to support tribal youth going through this time? We'll go to Jessica first and then Jonathan.
Yeah, I would say just making sure that you're diverting resources towards mental health care and opening up those conversations. We're obviously would love to talk with you one-on-one and see how we can collaborate. The Native youth, we're working with NCAI on an initiative called Movement as a Healing, and we're going to be doing that mostly at our upcoming conference this summer. But just please email us, come talk to us. We'd love to speak with you one-on-one and get to hear your perspectives, because these issues do plague all of Indian country, but can also be regionally and tribally specific. And so just making sure that, we're hearing the voices of Indian country, also just holding sessions with the youth of your nations and hearing their voices directly is always crucial and so important.
Great advice. Jonathan?
Right, good morning, and thank you, Dante, for that question. As President Lambert outlined in our address, this is an epidemic as it relates to suicide with Native youth suicide. And so I think we made a huge stride during the national conference, the convention, when we were able to pass the support for a national Native youth suicide prevention initiative. And this came from the United National Indian Tribal Youth Executive Committee. And we were able to move this through the NCAI resolution process. And so it goes back to tribal leaders sitting with Native youth and not just tribal leaders, but members of Congress, members of the administration, because it shouldn't be only a concern for tribal nations, but for our federal counterparts. So again, it's sitting with the youth and getting our perspective on the issues. And I think with this I Will Live initiative, which this has become NCAI policy coming from the United National Indian Tribal Youth based out of Mesa, Arizona. And I think we can really amplify that initiative and identifying resources. Thank you.
Yeah, good. So President Sharp, you had mentioned how important it is to be at the table and the elevated status that we've seen during this administration. So tell us, you were recently able to go over to Glasgow and attend the UN Summit on climate change. What was the difference this time? And getting, tell us about the elevated status that we received and what that meant to you and for Indian country.
Excellent question, Sioquil. Thank you. I can't even begin to put into words how that felt. The tribal leaders that long predated us have fought for decades to have a seat at the global table at the United Nations. And so to walk into a room, not only representing the voice of my tribe in the National Congress of American Indians, but at some point representing all the tribes and First Nations of North America. We're talking over 1,000 sovereign tribal nations at a time when we're dealing with the most critical issues facing our generation. And so there was a moment when we were able to gather all of the indigenous leaders globally. There were indigenous leaders from Africa, from Northern Siberia and Russia. There were from Northern Europe. I mean, just from all over. And many of those advocates told me that they had been trying almost an entire career to get a seat at the table to just have a conversation with the United States. And so when we gathered with John Kerry and Secretary Holland, and we were able to roundtable and hear from every part of the world on the rights of indigenous peoples and the impacts to our communities, there were some things that didn't matter if you were in the United States or if you were in Northern Siberia. The issues were the same. And the teachings are the same. And so it was incredibly powerful. It's a moment and experience I'll never forget. And coming from the administration, we heard from a number of them that this is the minimum going forward. We're only going to increase tribal representation and leadership. And so it was something that I will never forget. I've been attending these conferences for over 15 years. We've always been on the outside looking in, waiting to get text messages and updates. And this is something we were able to be right in the negotiations, have a seat directly at the table and be part of an incredible conversation when the rest of the world knows and understands the disproportionate impacts of climate change to indigenous peoples, where we have a voice and we have a direct say. So thank you for that question, Dante.
Well, good. And Congresswoman Davids, there's a lot of questions directed towards you in this, and I'm hoping you can I'm hoping I can condense this. The infrastructure with transportation, I know you were involved not just in getting tribes their direct funding, but having tribes be eligible for a larger pool. There's also questions on how do we get voting rights through, how do we get advanced appropriations? How are you approaching this? How strong is your voice? What help do you need? Where are we with all of that?
Well, one thing, so I will say that this past year with the most recent elections, The 2020 election and I had been saying this actually in the lead up to the 2020 elections, is that I truly believe that the power of the Native vote cannot be overstated. Our collective voice, when we are able to exercise our right to vote, we can literally change the path of elections by showing up and voting, which is part of why the Native American Voting Rights Act is so important, to make sure that those barriers that are unique to Indian country are broken down. And I think that in some ways that kind of answers what we can be doing, or what everybody can be doing to help get some of these policies across the finish line. One, reaching out to the senators, because there's a number of things that have already passed out of the House that are sitting in the Senate, and I'm not saying that for sure there's people in the Senate stopping it. It's just that sometimes it takes a lot of folks reaching out to elevate and push it further up the priority list on the Senate side. I'm not on the Senate side, so I can't say for certain, the timing and that sort of thing. But I do think it really, really helps when communities are reaching out to their senators. And I know that I can't follow all the comments, but the barriers in places like South Dakota, North Dakota, I know Arizona has seen some stuff. It's just, there are a lot of places where we can certainly use some help from the senators in those states. And then I think on the other parts of it, I mean, you all are already doing so much to raise and elevate the voices of Indian country amongst our lawmakers, and just like continuing to hammer on that. I mean, I will say that having, of course, when now Secretary Holland was in the House with me, it was almost like we had, because we sat on different committees. So in a lot of committees, there was almost always someone who was saying, hey, we got to make sure, well, what's the consultation process going to look like? How much funding is going to be there? How are we doing this different than we had been before from the federal government perspective? And so, recognizing that now we have that happening in different in different federal branches is pretty big. And then I do have to run. I'm so sorry. And I can see them moving around out there trying to pull me out. But can I just, one last thing? I really appreciate the efforts around the mental and behavioral health. I know I said this earlier, but in addition to folks in the federal government and whether it's Congress or the administration and tribal leaders, I just think as adults, we, it can be hard sometimes when people haven't learned coping mechanisms, and there's so much trauma that's, that has impacted so many generations of Indigenous people. But I do think that, we're in this era now where, and I think that young people made this happen, that folks recognize that we have to acknowledge and learn to heal from our trauma. And that's just all of us. I mean, all the adults, because that's going to be what helps our youth learn how to do that too. And so I'm very grateful for how many young people have been out there in a lot of ways helping those of us who, for Congress, I'm a baby, but in real life, I'm a grown up. And so I appreciate the efforts that our young people are making to help all of us, because sometimes the youth really do teach adults some of the most important lessons. So thank you all.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We really appreciate it. In the few minutes we have left, I'm going to open this up to Chairwoman Andrews Malteus. Chairwoman, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Actually, somewhat of a question, and just I wanted to send my my prayers for healing for all of our communities. I know it's been a long, long time, and it's good to see people's. And wanted to thank Representative Davids as well as President Sharp, Dante, yourself, as well as our Native youth leadership. It's really important to hear your voices, and thank you for the work that you all are doing. The impacts in of our general health and behavioral and emotional health have been tremendous. We continue to see and work towards trying to find ways to get better and more adequate funding, which we're not seeing. And what I was hoping that we'd be able to do is look at how we can better improve education and getting that information out to our congressional delegations on a more broad spectrum. I know we always go after our own, but two parts of that question is one, if we have a new plan on how we're going to strategically keep up the pressure on our congressional representatives and not just mine in my own area. Deploying us as leadership, whether it's our youth leadership or our tribal leadership, to have a consistent and pressure campaign so that they are aware that this is something that is too important for us to not have our consistent presence in Washington, D.C., knocking on their doors, basically old school, because we're looking at the administrative initiatives that are taking place. And we're also seeing that it's forcing us as tribal leaderships to prioritize. And there are far too many priorities for us to be able to sit there and say, take the top two, take the top three that we're always being asked to do. So what I'm looking for, I guess, is what type of a plan or strategy are we going to try to employ this time by re-envisioning what this administration can do for Indian country and re-envisioning that relationship so that we can be effective in our efforts to make the changes we need and get more parity and equality in funding for all of our tribal nations, whether they're in Alaska, the lower 48, or whether or not they're large tribes, small tribes, landless tribes, or large land-based tribes, or just high cost of living. We've got to do things differently. And I'm looking to see if we can have a discussion on that kind of a strategy moving forward. Thank you.
President Sharp?
Yes, good to hear your voice, Chairwoman. Much love, thoughts, and prayers to your community. Thank you for always standing up and being that voice and asking these questions. Really appreciate it. What I would say in response to the first part of your question, we definitely see the need to seize this moment. If COVID-19, as well as the climate impacts we've seen, have taught us anything, it is that the entire world has witnessed the impact to our communities, the disproportionate impact to our communities with the loss of life, with the loss of our resources. And in the climate context, the average citizen is starting to understand the role of tribal leaders, and they acknowledge that our treaties seem to be the last line of defense to protect our most sacred resources. And on the economic side of things, I think in a post-COVID world, there is going to, and there already is, not only a national strategy, but a global conversation about an economic recovery strategy and plan. And we've had one-on-one conversations with leaders in the House and the Senate to the extent the United States is at the table building and developing out an economic recovery plan. Tribal nations need to be there because there are partners domestically as well as internationally that want to deploy resources. And we know the scale of the pandemic and the experiences we've gone are well beyond the public treasury. We're seeing public and private partnerships. We're seeing philanthropy. And so our strategy going forward is to really shine a light to amplify the disproportionate impacts, to not let this generation of lost life through a pandemic and through climate change go without consequence and without holding our trustee accountable, without bringing those who are directly responsible for environmental degradation to be accountable, to secure the resources, because we know with both of these apocalyptic challenges we are facing, there's a duty owed to tribal nations. We have wisdom and knowledge, and we need to bring that all together to bear to really leverage this moment so that the loss of life is not without consequence and that we can make good on it. So going forward, the Congress, our board is going to be convening a strategy meeting going forward. You've heard me talk time and time again about we want NCAI to be a representative Congress with a tribal nation vision and agenda. And so I'm really looking forward. I'm excited to work side by side with just an incredible board that's bringing these ideas together. We have Larry Wright, who's now directly connecting with the regions. And I often speak about the power of Indian country lies within our own nations. The answers to every challenge lies within our nations. We all have ideas on building an economic recovery strategy, on restoring the health of our communities based on traditional medicine, based on traditional knowledge. And we need to unlock all of that together to meet these challenges going forward strategically. And by just simply doing that, we are going to be setting an example for the rest of the world to follow. Siakwil, thank you.
Thanks, President Sharp. And unfortunately, that's going to be the last question. I know I'm hoping Chairman Payment had his question answered by Congresswoman Davids. And I just want to give Jessica and Jonathan final comments, and then we're just going to wrap up this portion and invite you all to attend the Executive Council winter session starting in 15 minutes. So Jessica, any last thoughts? I know there's a lot of good comments about the youth representation today. And before we do go, I want to thank you, Jonathan and Simon, for your great representation.
Thank you so much, Dante. I would just reiterate, please reach out to us, contact us. We're currently hosting our Native Youth Leadership Summit, and tribal leaders are welcome to come. We don't want that only to be a space for Native youth. We want to be able to speak with you on how we can work together on making the future of Indian country incredible. And so please just reach out to us, let us know what's going on, and we just love to work with all of you. And we really appreciate NCAI, President Sharp, and Dante for giving us the opportunity to give the Youth State of Indian Nations address for the first time, which is so exciting. And we can't wait for this to be something that happens for years to come at NCAI. So thank you.
Jonathan?
Right, thank you, Dante and President Sharp. I feel we've established a voice for Native youth here at NCAI. And I say it's about time. And, you know, it was something that our Youth Commission talked about when we were first installed into our positions. And then it's that tribal youth at NCAI have a direct link to our tribal leaders, and that we can give our youth perspectives on the issues that are occurring around us. And so I think we've established something that will stand for future youth commissions to come. And so I also want to encourage our tribal leaders and those that are in attendance to join our Native Youth Leadership Summit. And I'll be happy to put my contact information in the chat as well. Again, you know, reiterating what President Lambert has said, you know, don't hesitate to contact us. And we look forward to working with our tribal leaders, our federal counterparts, and the executive board and the staff at NCAI as we continue to chart the course for our Native youth. You know, the time is now, and we are in that time to really set that path forward for our Native youth. So again, thank you to President Sharp and to Dante and the executive board and all of those in attendance for listening to us and to our concerns and our perspectives. So Hodgington, thank you.
Thank you to all the comments and questions in the chat. Give us a good indication of what we need to focus on going forward. NCAI.events for our next session. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.